Today I will be talking about the space race. The Soviet Union versus the United States. The space race occurred shortly after World War II. In 1955, both countries announced they'll be sending satellites into orbit. However, the Soviet Union took the lead by getting a satellite in orbit in 1957 named the Sputnik 1. Not too long after, the Soviets sent a living organism to space with the Sputnik 2. On the other hand, the USA came a little late to the party and launched their first satellite. The Explorer 1 came nearly 4 months later. On October 1st, 1958, NASA launched, replacing the NACA. On the 12th of April 1961, the Soviets came with another crushing blow to the United States by sending the first human to space. This man's name was Yuri Gagarin. He was the first man to make it a full orbit around Earth. He was in space for around an hour and 45 minutes. But on May 5th, 1961, the USA achieved their first pilot-controlled journey and first American in space, Alan Shepard, on the Mercury Redstone or Freedom 7. Shepard flew 116 miles up and the flight lasted around 10 to 15 minutes. On June 16, 1963, Valentina Tereshcheva was the first civilian and woman in space. She spent around 3 days in space, orbiting the Earth 48 times on the Vostok 6. On March 18, 1965, the Soviets made history again by sending Alexei Leonov into space, making history by doing a 12-minute spacewalk.
Thank you, Keyshawn. I'll be talking about the mid part of the space race and some fatalities in the space race, following the 12-minute spacewalk by Alexei Leonov. The United States responded by doing their own spacewalk on June 3, 1965, the United States being the first nation to perform a successful Mars voyage with the Venera 4, coming back with the first close-up on the Martian surface. In 1967, this was the most deadly year for the space race, killing 4 people: Ed White, Gus Grissom, and Roger Chaffee. All passed away when a fire started in Apollo 1 capsule on the launch pad. Just a couple months later, Vladimir Komarov was killed when a parachute on Soyuz 1 failed to open upon his return to Earth's atmosphere, killing him. The Soyuz 1 was the first space flight fatality. On September 14 through September 21, 1968, the Soviets accomplished the first spacecraft to orbit the Moon and Earth. The spacecraft was called the Zond 5. The United States responded to the USSR by becoming the first nation to have humans in the spacecraft while orbiting the Moon and Earth, and successfully returning to Earth. The name of the spacecraft was the Apollo 8. The United States was basically waiting for the Soviets to do something and just one-up them.
Thank you, Boss, for the really helpful information. 1969 was a very big year for the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. In February of 1969, the Soviets tried to launch the N-1, but it was a failure. The engine caught fire, causing the rocket to catch on fire, which caused the rocket to power off just a minute after takeoff. However, on July 3, 1969, the Soviets decided to test the N-1 again, but little did they know it was going to be the worst failure in the space race. Just a few seconds after takeoff, the rocket turned off and fell onto the launch pad and exploded into thousands of pieces. This destroyed the launch site and also destroyed the Soviets' pride in any hopes of getting a man on the moon before the United States. Just 17 days later, on July 20th, 1969, the United States launched the infamous Apollo 11 with Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, who were the first men on the moon, while Michelle Collins got the lame job and continued to orbit the moon. This is where we heard one of the most famous quotes by Neil Armstrong. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. That was it. America won. America won the space race. They had a slow start, but America picked it up and won the space race. I know know who won the space race, but why and when did the space race really end? Haidar?
On August 1st, David Scott was the first person to drive on the moon. David wasn't only known for his thought, he's also known for giving a tribute for all the astronauts that lost their lives in the space race, including the Soviets. This was one of the moments that led to the space race ending. Scott left a plaque of the astronauts' names that passed during the space race, and a picture of a small aluminum of an astronaut in an astronaut suit. In 1975, after letting the dust settle from the 20-year-old battle in space exploration, the very first Apollo-Soyuz mission happened. The two commanders, Alexei Levanov and Tom Stafford, shake hands in the first international handshake. This was it. A handshake ended a multi-billion-dollar space war. Very cinematic ending. This act helped there be many more international space exploration missions. On July 15th, 1975, just 5 years and 5 days after the great Apollo 11 moon landing, the space race ended.
Me and my group really appreciate you guys listening to us talk about the space race. We wanted to make it as, as entertaining as possible. So we added a few jokes, but we didn't want it to make it like super educational. So we appreciate you guys listening to us, and hopefully you learned something.
Step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. I believe it, Charlie. One ignition. Flat away, Houston. Vector good.
We're burning flat.
Roger.
Looks good, flight.
Observation flight.
Roger.
Bare bones car to allow the astronauts to cover much greater distance on the moon than the previous 3 flights could accomplish.
This is really a rock and roll ride, isn't it? Never been on a ride like this before. Oh boy.
It had a top speed of about 8 miles an hour, although I think in later flights they actually cranked that up to about 11 miles an hour. Scott and Irwin spent 3 days exploring the Apennine-Hadley region in the lunar rover. There's actually a plaque on the lunar rover vehicle that was left on the moon that says man's first wheels on the moon. The heavy focus on science for Apollo 15 was its primary feature. It was achieved 2 ways. One, of course, with the lunar rover vehicle on the moon to gather more lunar data. And secondly, the command service module carried a sim bay of scientific instruments that allowed Al Worden
When I was doing this video, I tried to go I tried to make it overly simplified, that YouTube channel Miss Rivetta usually have us watch, because I really enjoy that. Though I tried to recreate it, but without the drawings.